It was a regular morning at a luxury airport. The sun was barely up, but the hustle of the travelers filled the air. People were rushing in all directions. Business people, tourists, vacationers, all in a frenzy to get to their next destination. In the midst of it all, there he was, walking confidently toward the first-class check-in counter. The staff behind the desk barely glanced up as he approached. He was dressed simply, in a hoodie and jeans, his sneakers worn from years of travel. There was nothing flashy about his appearance, nothing that screamed wealth or power. But he stood tall, his presence undeniable. When he reached the counter, the woman behind the desk finally looked up. She gave him a quick once-over, raising an eyebrow as if she had already made up her mind about him. "First-class check-in is over there," she said, pointing to the far side of the terminal where the economy class lines were forming. He smiled politely, sliding his first-class ticket across the counter. She hesitated for a moment, then rolled her eyes. "Do you have any ID?" she asked, not even trying to hide her judgment. "Of course," he replied, his voice calm but firm. He handed her the identification that matched the name on the ticket. She stared at it for a moment, then glanced back up at him. Something was off. He didn't look the part, not in the slightest, and that alone made her doubt his validity. Without saying a word, she called over a security officer. "This man is attempting to board first class, but he doesn't appear to have the proper credentials," she said, her tone condescending. The officer, looking confused, approached the desk. "Sir, I'm afraid we'll need to ask you to step aside. There's been a mix-up with your boarding pass." He stood there for a second, taking in the situation. The whispers from nearby passengers started to pick up. People were already pulling out their phones, murmuring amongst themselves. He could hear their voices just barely, but it didn't matter. He'd been through worse. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to take the situation into his own hands. "We'll escort you to the other check-in area." He motioned toward the economy line, where long lines of passengers were already waiting. The CEO said nothing as he followed them. He knew how this story would go. When they reached the security checkpoint, the murmurs were louder. A few passengers couldn't help themselves, commenting out loud on how someone could try to act like they belonged in first class without looking the part. The man in the hoodie had been so out of place among the polished, suited business people that it almost seemed like a joke. "Who do they think they are?" one of the passengers muttered under his breath, his eyes still glued to the phone in his hand. The CEO remained calm. He had heard it all before. A few minutes later, the security guard finally turned to him. "Sorry for the confusion, sir. I'm afraid there's not much we can do here. You'll have to go through the economy section like the others." He nodded, his eyes calm. But as he turned away from them, he felt the weight of their stares. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he had built, the company he owned, the years of hard work it had taken to get here. What they didn't know, what they never could have known, was that the man they had just dismissed was, in fact, the one who held a significant stake in the airline. His company owned 40% of their business. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had the power to shut the entire operation down with a single phone call. And it was in that moment, when he was dismissed like just another regular passenger, that he decided to show them just how wrong they were. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. He didn't need to speak to anyone in particular. He didn't need to explain. The call was short, and as soon as the conversation ended, everything changed. At first, nothing happened. The staff continued with their daily routine, unaware that the storm was about to hit. But slowly, as the seconds ticked by, the airport began to feel a little different. It wasn't the same buzz of activity anymore. The atmosphere had shifted. Security personnel rushed by in a hurry. Airport managers received urgent calls, and it didn't take long before whispers began to spread through the corridors of the terminal. Something was happening. What they didn't know was that it had all started with a single, calm phone call. He had never planned on becoming the man he was today. The success, the wealth, the empire. None of it had been part of the plan when he was growing up. The city he was born in wasn't known for its wealth, and it certainly wasn't a place where dreams were easily realized. It was a place where people went through the motions of life, working hard just to get by, where the idea of ambition often felt like a foreign concept. But that never stopped him. Not even when the world tried to tell him he couldn't succeed. His earliest memories were of his mother, working late into the night to make ends meet. She'd never complain. She'd never ask for help. She was too proud, too determined to see her children succeed in a world that often treated them as if they didn't belong. It was his mother who had shaped him, instilled in him the idea that success wasn't just about money. It was about integrity, about proving to the world that you were capable of more, even if the world didn't believe in you. She would sit with him at the kitchen table after dinner, telling him stories about her own struggles. "You've got to fight for what you want, son," she would say. "Nobody's going to hand it to you, but if you want it bad enough, you'll make it happen." Her words echoed in his mind every day. They kept him going when the world tried to knock him down. He wasn't born into money. In fact, his family barely scraped by. His first job came at the age of 16, sweeping floors at a local warehouse. It was grueling work, but he didn't mind. At least he was doing something. At least he was earning. The job wasn't glamorous by any means. The warehouse was dimly lit, the floors always sticky with oil and grime. It smelled of machinery and old paper. But for him, it was a start. It was the first step toward something greater. Over the next few years, he worked at a variety of dead-end jobs. None of them paid well, but all of them taught him lessons he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He learned how to hustle, how to deal with people who didn't respect him, and how to keep his head down when the world seemed to want to stomp on him. During these years, he kept his eyes on the prize. The ultimate prize. Success. He knew that the only way out was through education. So while working multiple jobs, he saved every penny he could to put himself through college. It wasn't easy. College was expensive, and there were times when he wasn't sure how he was going to make it. But every time he was ready to give up, he thought about his mother, about how hard she had worked, about the sacrifices she made to give him a chance at something better. He couldn't quit. Not after everything she had done for him. By the time he graduated, he had already decided that he wasn't going to work for anyone else. He didn't want to be just another cog in the machine. He wanted to build something of his own, something that would make a difference. His first startup was a disaster. It was a small tech company he launched with a few friends he met in college. They had big dreams, big ideas, and no real understanding of how hard it was going to be to make them work. They overestimated their abilities, underestimated the market, and ended up losing everything. It was a hard lesson, but it was a lesson nonetheless. He didn't let it break him. Instead, he took what he had learned and started again. He didn't have the luxury of quitting, and he certainly didn't have the time to feel sorry for himself. He went back to the drawing board, figuring out where he had gone wrong. Over the next several years, he started and failed at several more ventures. It was a constant grind, but every failure taught him something valuable. He learned how to build a team, how to pitch to investors, how to manage his finances, and most importantly, how to keep going when everything seemed impossible. By the time he reached his 30s, he had founded a new company, one that was different from all the others. This time, he wasn't just focusing on technology. He was focusing on the bigger picture. His company invested in the aviation industry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was lucrative. The airline business was tough, but with the right strategies, he knew it could be a gold mine. He poured everything he had into this new venture, every ounce of energy, every last penny he had saved. It was his big chance. He couldn't afford to fail. And for once, it paid off. The company began to grow. Slowly at first, but then faster than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something more. It was about proving to himself and the world that he had the ability to build something that lasted. By the time he reached his late 30s, his company was worth billions. He had invested in numerous airlines, turning them into some of the most profitable businesses in the world. His name became synonymous with success. He went from struggling to pay bills to sitting at the head of a multi-billion-dollar empire. But even as his wealth and influence grew, he stayed humble. He never bought the flashy cars or the massive mansions that many of his peers flaunted. Instead, he kept a low profile. He preferred to dress simply, nothing too extravagant. Just a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. His success wasn't about showing off. It was about the work he put in, the sacrifice and the drive that got him there. And that's why, when he was walking through that airport in his hoodie and jeans, nobody recognized him. Nobody knew who he really was. They saw a man who didn't look like he belonged in first class and decided he didn't. They couldn't have been more wrong. In that moment, as he was being dismissed by the airline staff, he wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was disappointed. He had worked too hard to be treated like this, too hard to be disrespected by people who didn't understand what it took to get to the top. But he wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't just about the inconvenience of being denied access to a flight. This was about the larger issue, people constantly judging others based on their appearances. People assuming that if you didn't look the part, you didn't have the right to be somewhere. But he had earned that right, and he was going to make sure they knew it. He could feel his pulse quicken as he stood there, his phone still in his hand. He knew what was coming next, and he wasn't about to back down. With one simple call, everything was about to change. And as he pressed the button to dial the number, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the moment he would show them all just how wrong they had been. The moment his finger touched the screen, he felt a sense of calm. The anticipation was there, but the frustration that had built up in his chest began to dissipate. He wasn't just going to be another person who let this slide. This time, he would make sure the world knew how dangerous assumptions could be. His call wasn't going to just change his day. It was going to change the perception of how people viewed those who, for whatever reason, didn't fit the mold of what society thought success looked like. The phone rang only twice before the familiar voice on the other end answered. "Mr. Harris, how can I assist you today?" The voice was calm, professional, the kind you would expect from a seasoned assistant. He didn't hesitate. "It's time," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I need to speak with him." There was a long pause. "Mr. Harris, are you sure? It's—" "Yes, now," he cut in, his tone firm. He could almost hear the assistant's breath catch, followed by the sound of scrambling fingers on a keyboard, trying to figure out the most direct way to connect him with the person he needed to speak to. The line went quiet, save for the soft hum of distant voices and the occasional beep of an incoming message. And then, the most powerful voice in the airline industry came through. "Mr. Harris," the man said, "what can I do for you?" For a moment, the CEO simply listened to the voice. It wasn't just a voice of power. It was the voice of someone who had taken everything he'd built for granted. The arrogance was palpable, even through the phone. He leaned back into his seat, exhaling slowly as he processed the moment. This was it. The pivotal moment. The moment he would finally take action and force the world to reckon with how they viewed him. "I'm standing at the airport," he began, his voice measured, "and your staff has just denied me access to my first-class seat. They've told me I don't belong." There was a noticeable pause on the other end. The CEO could hear the man's breath catch. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harris, but are you sure it's not a mistake?" "No," the CEO replied. "They've refused me, straight up. They looked me up and down and made assumptions based on the way I dress. And because of those assumptions, I'm being treated like I'm invisible. So now, I'm going to make sure they understand what it means to disrespect someone like me." Another silence. This one more charged than before. The CEO's finger drummed softly on the edge of the armrest as he waited for the response he knew was coming. "Mr. Harris," the voice said, now laced with fear. Please give me a moment. I'll get in touch with someone." "No," the CEO interrupted, his voice cold and calculated. "There's no need. The damage is done. What's done is done. And now, I need to speak to the person who can handle this. I need you to shut the entire operation down." There was another long pause on the other end of the line. This time, the man's voice seemed strained. "You're shutting it down? Are you certain that's necessary?" "It's not a request," the CEO said, his voice still even but tinged with authority. "I've spent my life building this company. I've spent my entire existence proving that I belong in spaces like first class. And now, because I don't fit into the mold of what you assume success should look like, I'm going to remind you all of exactly who I am." The assistant on the other end was quiet for several seconds, likely doing mental calculations, trying to figure out if this was a bluff, if this was something he could just talk his way out of. But the CEO wasn't bluffing. He wasn't someone who ever backed down from a fight, especially when it came to his integrity and his name. He had worked too hard to build an empire that allowed others to dream. For too long, people like him had been dismissed. He couldn't let this slide. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," the CEO said calmly. "You've made an error, and you will fix it. Now." The man on the other end of the phone seemed to stammer before he spoke again, his voice cracking under the pressure. I'll make the call," he said. "Please just give me a moment." But the CEO wasn't finished. His mind was already turning, already calculating the best way to turn the tables. There were people involved in this decision-making process, and they needed to know exactly who they had just crossed. The call ended abruptly, and the CEO leaned back against the plush seat, closing his eyes for just a moment. He could feel the power shifting. Less than an hour later, he received the confirmation. The operation was being shut down, but it wasn't just the airport or the airline that was affected. No, this was bigger than that. He had decided to call in a few favors, to remind the powers that be who was pulling the strings. And now, the airline was reeling, scrambling to control the damage. Their arrogance would cost them far more than they could have ever anticipated. He hadn't even raised his voice once, and yet he had managed to put them all in a position where they had no choice but to act. But what was even more satisfying than the closure of an entire airline was the realization that no one would ever dismiss him again. This wasn't just about the first-class seat. It was about sending a message to everyone who had ever looked at someone like him and assumed they didn't belong in a place of power. For too long, people like him had been judged for their appearance, for their choices, for their backgrounds. It was time to flip the script. It was time for people to remember who they were dealing with. And then, as if to underscore the point, the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the assistant. It wasn't anyone trying to smooth things over. It was the CEO of the airline himself. His voice was shaky, almost pleading. "Mr. Harris, what do you want us to do? How can we fix this?" The CEO's response was simple but heavy with meaning. "Make it right," he said, his voice like steel. "And I'll consider the matter closed. Otherwise, you'll see exactly what happens when you make the wrong assumption." The phone call ended, but the message had been delivered. The CEO sat back, his mind racing with what had just transpired. The world, at least for him, had tilted on its axis, and now he had the power to tilt it back. But power wasn't always about being loud or making a scene. It was about control. It was about understanding the people who thought they were in charge, who believed they had the final say, and then showing them how quickly things could crumble when those with real influence decided to act. He knew the consequences. He knew the ripple effect his decision would cause, and in some ways, he welcomed it. The airline industry was already a complex web of high-stakes maneuvering, but his influence stretched further than most people realized. For a moment, the phone sat in his hand. He had made his move, and now the waiting game began. But this was the part that intrigued him the most. He was about to watch the world scramble, and it didn't take long for the first signs of it to unfold. The phone rang again. This time, it wasn't just the airline's assistant calling in a panic. It wasn't an apologetic plea. No, this was the corporate brass, the top of the top. The ones who made the decisions that controlled the lifeblood of the airline. "Mr. Harris?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but this time there was no pretense of calm. There was only urgency. "We need to resolve this. I understand you're upset, but we're looking at a situation that could bring down not just our operations, but the entire fleet." He leaned forward, his posture stiffening. The words stung. They knew the extent of the damage now, and it wasn't just about a single incident of being denied access to a first-class seat. No, the moment he made his call, he had shifted the entire perception of what could happen if someone powerful was wronged. "The problem," he replied, his voice cutting through the tension, "is that your people didn't just deny me a seat. They denied me the respect I've earned. And I want them to feel what that means. I want the world to understand that when people like me speak, the world listens." There was a brief silence on the other end. He could hear the scrambling, the anxiety creeping into their voices. "We're working on a solution," the voice said, "but I must warn you, this could cause long-term damage. This might even affect our stock prices. The board is—" "Do you really think I care about your stock prices?" he snapped, his patience wearing thin. "What I care about is principle. I care about respect. You want to talk about the board? The board is not who made the decision to humiliate me. It was your employees. You're going to take care of it immediately, and you're going to do it my way." Another pause. The weight of the words hung in the air. The power dynamic had completely shifted. The man on the other end of the line wasn't speaking to a regular customer or even a VIP. He was speaking to a force of nature, someone who had the power to collapse entire systems with a single call. "I understand," the man said, though his voice still trembled. "I'll handle it. Please allow us to make amends." "Good," the CEO said, his tone still sharp but now satisfied. "Make it right. And remember, you may be the one at the top now, but don't ever forget who controls the narrative. If you don't get this handled, I will ensure that the world knows exactly how far you're willing to go to disrespect people like me." The call ended, and the CEO allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. But this wasn't about winning the battle. It was about winning the war. He'd made his point. And now, he would watch as those who thought they could control everything scrambled to keep their empire intact. The aftermath didn't take long to unfold. Within hours, a public statement was released. The airline issued a formal apology, claiming that the incident had been a misunderstanding and offering the CEO a first-class lifetime pass as a peace offering. It was a pathetic attempt to smooth things over. The media frenzy began almost immediately. News outlets picked up on the story, and within hours, social media exploded with reactions. Some people sided with the CEO, applauding him for standing up against a system that continually underestimated people based on their appearance. Others criticized the airline for mishandling the situation in the first place. But the story wasn't over yet. No, it was just beginning. The CEO knew that this wasn't about him getting his pass or the superficial apology. It was about sending a message to every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. It was about proving that respect was something you demanded, not something you earned because of what others thought you should be. As the press coverage continued to snowball, the CEO found himself facing a familiar dilemma. He was no stranger to controversy. But this was different. This wasn't just another business deal gone wrong. This was a personal statement, and he was determined to make sure it was heard loud and clear. He wasn't the kind of man who took pride in putting people down, but he understood the importance of using his influence when it mattered. And this time, it mattered. Days passed, and while the media frenzy cooled, the damage to the airline was far from over. The CEO's call had opened a Pandora's box. What started as an issue of one person being mistreated had turned into a full-blown public relations nightmare. The company's image was in tatters, and the people who had been responsible for the initial mistake were now under intense scrutiny. As for the CEO, his influence had grown even more. He didn't need to shout from the rooftops to prove his point. He had already made his move, and now the world was watching. But what surprised even him was the unexpected ripple effect of his actions. People from all walks of life reached out to him, some with words of encouragement, others with their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. They saw what he had done and felt empowered to do the same in their own lives. The CEO's decision had transcended the original incident. It was no longer just about an airline. It was about making a stand. It was about reminding everyone that people, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their financial status, deserved respect. The phone call had come from a number he didn't recognize. He hadn't been expecting it, but he knew it had to be important. The world had been watching, and now the true scale of what he had set into motion was beginning to unfold. "Mr. Harris?" The voice on the other end was authoritative, almost chilling in its calmness. I believe you've made your position very clear." The CEO listened intently, his hand gripping the arm of the chair. He had been bracing for something like this. The world was always watching, and people in power often couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "That's right," he replied, his voice steady. "And now, I believe you understand the consequences of ignoring someone like me." The person on the other end paused before responding, choosing their words carefully. "You've made a public spectacle of our airline. There are already signs of a significant dip in stock prices. Media outlets are all over this. But what concerns me the most is the effect this has on our partners." "Good," the CEO responded bluntly. "Let them be concerned. Let them feel the sting of being out of touch. If they weren't paying attention before, they will now." The voice at the other end sighed, a sharp contrast to the calm authority that had been present at first. "You've caused a ripple, Mr. Harris, and ripples have a way of becoming tsunamis." He could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. He had known this would happen. He had known that once he made his move, he would be under scrutiny like never before. But what surprised him wasn't the backlash. It was the quiet realization that his actions had sparked something larger. His phone buzzed again, signaling more incoming calls. This time, it was from an even higher level. The people who ran the financials, the shareholders, and the corporate giants who controlled vast industries. These weren't the everyday negotiators. These were the titans who had the power to reshape entire sectors of the economy. But the CEO wasn't worried. In fact, he was more certain than ever that his actions had been the right move. It wasn't just about getting even. It was about setting the stage for something bigger. It didn't take long for the ripple effect to reach other companies. The stock market, usually a cold, impersonal machine, reacted quickly to the unfolding story. And the reaction wasn't limited to just one airline. Businesses across various sectors began to feel the tremors of the CEO's call. Other CEOs, board members, and corporate executives began to take notice. The media, ever eager for a story, fed the frenzy. "Corporate disrespect, the CEO who took matters into his own hands," the headlines read. The narrative had shifted from a singular incident of mistreatment to a full-blown examination of corporate power dynamics. The CEO's name became synonymous with standing up for one's rights, no matter how powerful the opposition. And as the media coverage intensified, so did the public's reaction. Thousands of people, ordinary citizens, workers from all walks of life, shared their stories. They spoke of the times they had been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated by those in positions of power. Some shared tales of racial injustice. Others recounted being looked down on for their socio-economic status or appearance. The CEO had unwittingly sparked a movement, and it was clear that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the world waking up to the fact that respect wasn't a luxury. It was a right. He had intended to make a point, to show how swiftly things could change when the right person spoke up. But what had started as a personal affront had now become something much larger. It wasn't just a business issue. It was a cultural one. Meanwhile, the airline's executives scrambled to contain the fallout. A few public relations professionals were brought in, but they couldn't stop the wave that had already begun. There were meetings, phone calls, and urgent discussions with key stakeholders, but nothing they did could reverse the damage. Every time they issued a new apology or tried to smooth things over, it seemed to make the situation worse. The CEO, however, remained calm. He watched from the sidelines, knowing that the real game was unfolding behind closed doors. The airline's management was beginning to understand just how far-reaching his influence had become. But it wasn't just about saving face anymore. It was about control. The power dynamics had been irrevocably altered. A few days later, the airline released a formal statement. This time, it wasn't just an apology. It was a complete overhaul of their internal policies. They announced the implementation of new diversity and inclusion training programs, a complete restructuring of their customer service protocols, and an expansion of their executive team to include more representatives from underrepresented communities. It was, on paper, a step in the right direction. But the CEO knew it was just a reaction. It wasn't about making amends. It was about damage control. The real question was whether these changes would be enough to quell the growing unrest within the company, or whether it was too little, too late. He knew that the airline wasn't the only one facing pressure. Corporate America, as a whole, was being forced to confront its deep-seated issues. It wasn't enough to just make superficial changes. They had to re-examine their core values. And that was exactly what the CEO intended to make happen. Not just for the airline, but for every company that had ever believed it could ignore the voices of the people. The public outcry didn't just subside after the apology. It gained momentum. People weren't satisfied with just a change in corporate policy. They wanted accountability. They wanted to see that those who had been in power for so long would be held responsible for their actions. And in the midst of it all, the CEO's actions continued to resonate. He became a symbol for those who had long been silenced, for those who had been pushed to the margins. His name was no longer just associated with business. It was a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been underestimated. The media coverage continued, and soon, documentaries and podcasts began to crop up, all centered around the incident. The story of the CEO's call became a case study in how power could be wielded not with anger or force, but with precision and understanding. His actions were being analyzed in boardrooms and classrooms alike, as people began to see the larger implications of what he had done. And while the airline was still trying to salvage its reputation, the CEO had already moved on. He had made his point. The world knew who he was, and they knew what he stood for. But there was something deeper at play. This wasn't just a story about one man's revenge or the downfall of a company. It was the beginning of a new kind of conversation, one that would reshape how businesses interacted with their customers, how they treated their employees, and how they regarded power. Weeks had passed since the moment the CEO had made that fateful call. What had started as a personal issue, a wrongful denial of a first-class seat, had ignited something far bigger than anyone could have anticipated. The world had watched, transfixed by the unfolding drama, and now the ripples had turned into waves. People everywhere were talking about power, respect, and the value of self-worth. The airline had made its moves, implementing policies, apologizing publicly, and even restructuring its leadership to demonstrate its commitment to diversity and inclusivity. But deep down, the CEO knew that these actions were simply a reaction, a bandage on a wound that needed much deeper healing. The airline could change its policies, but the culture, the mindset, would take far longer to shift. And yet, the CEO felt no satisfaction in watching them scramble. His mission was never about revenge. It was about making people understand that no one should be dismissed or belittled, no matter who they were. His actions had exposed a flaw in a system that had operated unchecked for too long. Now, it was time to move forward. He leaned back in his office chair, looking out over the city below. It had been a long journey, but the end of this chapter felt like the beginning of something much larger. His team had grown stronger in the wake of his decision, and his influence had spread far beyond the walls of his own company. But that didn't mean he was ready to rest on his laurels. The phone rang again, and as he answered, it was the familiar voice of his assistant, Lisa. "Mr. Harris, you have a call with the board in 5 minutes. They want to discuss the next steps, especially regarding the public response to what happened." He nodded. "Send them in." Minutes later, a group of high-ranking executives filed into his office, taking their seats with a quiet tension in the air. These were the very same individuals who had doubted him when the initial crisis began, the ones who had questioned his decision to expose the flaws in the system. Now, they were looking at him with a mix of respect and curiosity, aware that the game had changed, and that they had to change with it. The CEO stood up, pacing slowly as he addressed the group. "You all saw the headlines, the media storm, the protests, the shifts in public opinion. But this isn't just about what happened with the airline. It's about what it represents. It's about corporate America and the way we've operated for decades. We've been blinded by privilege, by status, by money, and we've forgotten something crucial. We work for the people, not the other way around." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, there was no back and forth, no dismissive comments or eye rolls. These executives were listening. "The world is changing," he continued, "and if we're not prepared to change with it, we'll be left behind. The next generation of consumers doesn't care about flashy ads or elite status. They care about honesty, integrity, and the values that drive us. We can't afford to ignore that anymore. We can't afford to treat people as if their worth is defined by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account." The board members exchanged glances. It was clear that some were still processing, while others were beginning to see the shift that had already taken place. The CEO wasn't just talking about the airline or even his own company. He was speaking to the larger corporate culture, one that had been deeply entrenched for years. And he knew that this was where the real change had to happen. It wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to write new policies. The foundation of how they operated had to be rebuilt from the ground up. "From this moment forward," the CEO said, "we're not just going to be a company, we're going to be a movement. A company that stands for fairness, for justice, for respect. And I won't tolerate anything less. We will lead by example, not just in how we do business, but in how we treat every person who interacts with us. No one will be above reproach, and no one will be dismissed simply because they don't fit into a narrow mold." The executives remained silent, but their faces showed something different than before: understanding, perhaps even admiration. Later that evening, after the meeting had adjourned, the CEO took a moment to reflect on how far things had come. A year ago, he would have never predicted that a single act of standing up for himself would lead to such a widespread transformation. But then again, he realized, it wasn't just about him. It was about all the voices that had been silenced for too long. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't matter simply because they didn't fit the standard. He had become a symbol, not because he wanted to, but because his actions had sparked something larger. People had stood with him, and now they were demanding more, not just from the companies they interacted with, but from the world at large. But there was still one last piece to the puzzle. The airline's CEO had contacted him earlier that day, requesting a meeting. The situation had only worsened for them. The damage to their reputation had been severe, and despite their public apology, they were facing pressure from all sides, from their customers, their investors, and even their employees. They wanted to make things right, but the damage had already been done. The CEO met with them the following morning. "I'm not here to offer a simple solution," he told the airline's leadership. "You can't undo what's been done, but you can choose how you move forward." The world is watching, and if you truly want to be a part of the change, you need to prove it, not with words, but with actions. They listened, their expressions serious. The CEO laid out his vision: true, meaningful change that would go beyond the superficial apologies and knee-jerk policy changes. He spoke about leadership development, mentorship programs, and a radical restructuring of how they approached customer service. But it wasn't just about the business side. It was about fostering an environment where every employee felt valued, regardless of their background or status. The airline agreed to the proposal, and the partnership was formed not just as a business agreement, but as a social pact. They would rebuild together, slowly and methodically, and they would do it right. As the CEO left the meeting, a quiet calm washed over him. He hadn't set out to destroy anyone, just to shine a light on a truth that had been ignored too long. One action had sparked a ripple that would echo for years. His phone buzzed one last time that evening. It was a message from his assistant. "The board approved your new initiative. It's official. You've just set a new precedent." The CEO smiled, but it wasn't out of pride. It was out of something deeper, satisfaction in knowing that the world had changed, and that he had been part of that change.